Hey guys, how's it going? This is Imani checking in with you all to review Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. First, a brief history on this classic novel. Jane Austen started working on Pride and Prejudice in 1797 and published it in 1813. She was born during the Georgian era, which was in many ways a period of transition. There was a rising middle class with a burgeoning consumer culture. This caused a change from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy. All these changes resulted in a social instability. This was also the start of the women's rights movement. Austen pioneered a new style of writing, third-person discourse, in which she slips in and out of various characters' minds. This is different from third-person limited because she goes into the minds of more than one character, but is also different from third-person omniscient because the narrator is not all-knowing. Third-person discourse is still a widely used style of writing today, seen in series such as Legend by Marie Lu. But alas, we stray off topic. Pride and Prejudice has been made into movies, theater shows, and many other adaptations. The book is still widely read and treasured around the globe. Now, what is this prize novel about? Well, I suppose we can compare the plot of the story to that of a soap opera. The news that a wealthy young gentleman named Charles Bingley has rented the manor of Netherfield Park causes a great stir in the Bennet household. The Bennets have 5 unmarried daughters, from oldest to youngest, Jane, Elizabeth, Mary, Kitty, and Lydia. And Mrs. Bennet, their mother, is desperate to see them all married. After Mr. Bennet pays a social visit to Mr. Bingley, the Bennets attend a ball at which Mr. Bingley is present. He is much taken with Jane and spends much of the evening dancing with her. His close friend, Mr. Darcy, is less pleased with the evening and haughtily refuses to dance with Elizabeth, which makes everyone view him as arrogant and obnoxious. However, Mr. Darcy starts to find himself increasingly attracted to Elizabeth's charm and intelligence over the next few weeks. Jane falls sick, forcing her to stay at Netherfield for several days. In order to tend to Jane, Elizabeth hikes through muddy fields and arrives with a splattered dress, much to the disdain of the snobbish Miss Bingley, Charles Bingley's sister. Miss Bingley's spite only increases when she notices that Darcy, whom she is pursuing, pays quite a bit of attention to Elizabeth. When Elizabeth and Jane return home, they find Mr. Collins visiting their household. Mr. Collins is a young clergyman who stands to inherit Mr. Bennet's property, which has been entailed, meaning that it can only be passed down to male heirs. Shortly after his arrival, Mr. Collins makes a proposal of marriage to Elizabeth. Elizabeth refuses, much to her mother's disdain. Wickham, a handsome young soldier who is friendly towards Elizabeth, later tells her how Darcy cruelly cheated him out of his inheritance. As winter progresses, Jane visits the city to see her friends, hoping that she might see Mr. Bingley. However, Miss Bingley visits her and behaves rudely, while Mr. Bingley fails to visit her at all. The marriage prospects for the Bennet girls appear bleak. One day, Darcy makes a shocking proposal of marriage to Elizabeth while she is staying at the Collins, which she quickly refuses. She tells Darcy that she considers him arrogant and unpleasant, then scolds him for steering Bingley away from Jane and disinheriting Wickham. Darcy leaves her, but shortly thereafter delivers a letter to her. In this letter, he admits that he urged Bingley to distance himself from Jane, but claims he only did so because he thought their romance was not serious. As for Wickham, he informs Elizabeth that the young officer is a liar and that the real cause of their disagreement was Wickham's attempt to elope with his young sister, Georgiana Darcy. Elizabeth starts reevaluating her feelings towards Mr. Darcy, and later visits Pemberley, after making sure that Darcy is away, and delights in the buildings and grounds, while hearing from Darcy's servants that he is a wonderful, generous master. Suddenly, Darcy arrives and behaves cordially towards her. Making no mention of his proposal, he entertains the gardeners and invites Elizabeth to meet his sister. Wickham and Lydia get married and return to Longbourn briefly, then depart for Wickham's assignment in the north of England. Shortly thereafter, Bingley returns to Netherfield and resumes his courtship of Jane. Darcy goes to stay with him and pays visits to the Bennets, but makes no mention of his desire to marry Elizabeth. Bingley, on the other hand, presses his suit and proposes to Jane, to the delight of everyone but Bingley's haughty sister. Later, Elizabeth and Darcy go out walking together, and he tells her that his feelings have not altered since the spring. She tenderly accepts his marriage proposal. Both Jane and Elizabeth are married, and everyone lives happily ever after. So what does this all mean, and what is Miss Austen trying to point out to her audience? Well, let's start by looking at themes. Love, reputation, pride, money, and women's rights are some of the most prominent themes throughout Pride and Prejudice. Austen uses characterization to reveal her characters' places in the plot, as well as to reveal their social status and reputations. For example, while Mr. Bingley is painted in a good light, Mr. Darcy, the eventual romantic interest of Elizabeth, is described as quite the opposite. He was discovered to be proud, to be above his company, and above being pleased, and not all his large estate in Derbyshire could then save him from having a most forbidden, disagreeable countenance and being unworthy to be compared with his friend, writes Miss Austen. However, the audience later realizes that Darcy is not the cold, hard man we all assumed he was. By using a slow character reveal, Austen adds an element of humor as well as suspense to her novel. Austen uses irony to exacerbate the themes of women's right, or rather lack thereof. Austen opens her novel with, "It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife." The audience sees that it is not the rich man who wants a wife, but in fact the mothers and ladies who want the rich husband, and believe in this not-so-universal truth. Mrs. Bennet is a prime example of a mother who greatly values the appearances of rich men in order to render her daughters with a prospective husband. This shows how women are forced to get married because they are unable to possess land or wealth on their own. Therefore, they are forced to acknowledge and abide by Austen's universal truth. Austen also employs the use of foreshadowing to add to the dramatic mood of the novel. The external troubles to Mr. Bingley's relationship with Jane are foreshadowed by his attitude towards the beginning of the novel. Miss Bingley was therefore established as a sweet girl, and their brother felt authorized by such commendation to think of her as he chose. Shows how necessary Mr. Bingley feels it is to have others' approval, which later proves to be a wedge in his and Jane's blooming romance. This ultimately foreshadows how easily influenced Mr. Bingley is, and this is shown when Mr. Darcy drives a block between the two lovers when he forces them apart. Lastly, the title of Pride and Prejudice is very telling of the plot in itself. At the beginning of the novel, Elizabeth represents pride and Darcy represents prejudice, which forces them to dislike each other. As the novel progresses, we see that all the characters in the novel, including Elizabeth and Darcy, have both a lot of pride and prejudice. In fact, their lives essentially revolve around these two concepts. The entire society is obsessed with social classes and wealth, leaving no room for any actual love. However, it is only when characters start leaving behind these social constructs that they truly start to fall in love. Elizabeth and Darcy are the last to leave behind their pride and prejudice, but when they do, they are able to realize their feelings for each other, leading them to a happy ever after. Austen is trying to tell her audience to leave behind their pride and prejudice as well, because doing so will open up their world and lead them to find their own love. Okay guys, that's all for today. And ladies, just remember, when a guy calls you tolerable, next thing you know, he'll be proposing to you, just like Mr. Darcy did to Elizabeth. See you guys later!